Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Solutions podcast. I am here today with Yuli Somme, who has revived the making of shrouds. And so today we're going to talk about the ecology of death. So welcome, Yuli.
Thank you.
So it's exciting, to have these conversations. And I know we've discussed this many times before, that death is not something that most people want to talk about or consider. It is inevitable, but somehow, there's a bit of a taboo around us talking about it. So it's really exciting, the work, what Yuli does, and us really being able to have like an open conversation about life, death, burial, and how we get buried. So Yuli, maybe you can start by, how did you start up getting involved with this?
It's funny that you call it exciting because most people, I find when I have a conversation with, what do you do? And I go, and it either stops the conversation, I'm a shroud maker, or it's kind of really, and then people are drawn in and they want to know more. But how I started was thinking about the life cycle and how we seem to have, as human, the human race, we seem to have disconnected ourselves from the life cycle. And that's reflected in our rituals and ceremonies, which I think a lot of people might find, they agree with me, that they are very often quite hollow. And I've created this word called blandadized. I hope you understand that. Bland and standard. So the two words, blandadized. So it's sort of, I think most of us will have been to funerals that are just really hollow and empty. And who is this person? Is there a person in that box? Really? We put them in this wooden, or MDF mostly, full of glues, box, and we have to make believe that that person is in there. And it's really difficult to make that sort of connection. What's going to happen to that person? Mostly 82% are burnt. Anyway, so I was thinking about this whole cycle, and it was very much a personal thing too, because my father died when I was 5 years old. And so that was in 1961. And in those days, if you're a child and a parent dies, it tends to not be acknowledged that a child needs to have that connection with death, needs to try to understand. And so those conversations that I felt I needed as a 5-year-old didn't happen. And the same with my two siblings. It was wrapped up in euphemisms like, he's gone to a better place. And so as a child, you think, well, I want to go there. Where's this better place? How great, let's all go there, So that sort of thing would happen. And I think the three of us, myself, my sister, and my brother, felt that lack of acknowledgement and the need in very different ways. So for me, I developed various phobias. My brother had a big breakdown when he was in his teenage years, and my sister married totally the wrong person and stayed with him for 44 years before she realized how bad it was. So it had a huge impact. These days, I think there's a lot more help for bereaved children. So thankfully, that's something that has improved, generally speaking. So that was the second thing, really. And so the first thing was that disconnect. The second thing was my own personal thing. And the third thing I think, was my interest in the history of wool. So I am a woolly person, entirely dressed in wool today, and textiles. So, that's my background, weaving. And then I became a felt maker in the 1980s and made all sorts of strange things, costumes and masks and wacky wall hangings and things like that. But I'd been aware that in the 17th century, the UK government passed a law that decreed that the dead must be buried in wool. And that was self-interest in perpetuating the very lucrative wool trade, which was taking a bit of a hit from imports. So we were exporting a lot of woven cloth. We were experts, here where I live in Devon, it was, mills, so many mills, weaving, spinning and weaving. And then it sort of slowly moved up towards Yorkshire when the Industrial Revolution started kicking in, and that was in, the Industrial Revolution. There's a blackbird just out there. Sorry, diverted by a lovely blackbird trying to find food in the snow. So the Industrial Revolution was kicked off by the desire, don't know if it was a need, but the desire to speed up the spinning of wool to create yarn that was then woven into our famous, weaving industry. So I was really interested in that, in combination with my interest in wool and my passion for working with wool.
So when was the shift between being wrapped in a shroud and buried and being put in a box? When did that happen? When did we have that change?
I'm not absolutely sure. I mean, the image of a coffin is quite old. I don't know when coffins as such started to be made. I think they're probably quite ancient, but I think it was the Victorians that changed a lot about funerals. They if you imagine a funeral now, what does the funeral look like? It's top hats, it's black, it's mourning, somberness, black hearses, solid coffins, and then all the sort of films and horror things that come out of that sort of gothic thing. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we also had biers, B-I-E-R, not beers to drink, but beers to lay a body on. So they were stretchers basically to carry people to a grave, and then you would just bundle the person into the grave. So I would love to know more. I haven't had time to research all that, but I think it's.
But I suppose if we look at even, the Egyptian tombs and, for a long time, yes, people have been being, and the crazy thing in Ecuador I've seen is that they get buried in metal coffins. I know what this idea is about how you're going to last forever, or why on earth would you want to be buried in a metal coffin? But so, different places do, have these different ideas of, of how we bury our dead, and then, how that carries on, and I know through South and Central America, they have this amazing Day of the Dead where you go and really celebrate your loved ones that have passed over. And so much about this idea of celebrating the life of somebody rather than, mourning the death of them. And it's a two-way thing, isn't it? And this idea of putting somebody in a shroud, a lot of people, it's like, whoa, they feel quite uncomfortable with that idea of actually seeing the shape of the body, wrapped up. So how have you kind of addressed that feeling for the people that like the idea of wrapping their loved ones in wool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just going back to the metal box, I think that is part of the disconnect, because that's not doing anything spiritually and it's not doing anything environmentally. But yes, so when I first started out, I had a co-founder who's a very, very good friend of mine, but she's kind of retired from it. And we discussed a lot that very question: how are we going to get people to accept that this is not a coffin, but it's a shroud? Let's get used to the word, because some people don't even know what that means. They've not heard it before. So a shroud traditionally would have been a woven cloth, which is different to felted fabric. So I make felt. Well, I've had it made. I used to make felt. This is felt, but now I commission it because I used large quantities of it, and it's 5 millimeters thick and is classed as non-woven, and it's also non-flammable as well, which is a real plus when we're talking about the wider implications of fabrics and fire retardants. So wool is probably the only fabric that you don't need a fire retardant in, and that is polluting our rivers, unfortunately. So that's a bit of an aside there. But felt flows over the body. It doesn't fold over the body. So if you imagine it's equivalent to having leather, a sheet of leather over the body, it sort of floats over it. So we thought we were on to something there, in that we could gently bring in this concept of a coffin-free funeral. And it's a shroud, so let's get used to that word, but it's not like you see the shape of the feet and the hands over the breast or whatever, you know, which you do with a mummy or with somebody wrapped up in a woven cloth, so spun yarn, whatever it is, silk, cotton, synthetic wool, whatever, and then woven. A woven cloth, like, you know, any of this, will fold over your body, you know, will show all the curves. So felt is different. So that was one of the things that we felt was a real USP, you know, that it was a unique selling point, because woolen shrouds in the past, which were what the Act decreed, you know, that the dead of the 17th Century Act, 1666, the 17th Century Act decreed that the dead must be buried in wool. Sorry, I think I didn't explain that before. That was what the government wanted to do, was to get wool used more marketing, basically, you know. Hey, isn't this a great idea? But if it's enshrined in law, then it means you have to do that or you're fined. So, you know, when I first started out with my friend Anne, we thought, well, this is a really good starting point. Wouldn't it be great if they changed the law now that the dead must be buried in wool? You know, there's lots of discussions around that, and you know, the concept that George Monbiot's coined of sheep wrecking the land and all that sort of thing. You know, I don't know if we'll have time to go into that, but I feel that wool is something that we must turn to for the future of textiles, and we must bring it back to this country, not do it outside of the country in China or wherever. We must bring it back. And so what we're doing is all part of localizing funerals. Let's bring it back like we have with birth, you know, or some of us have with birth, you know, bring it back to the home, bring death back to the home, so people can die at home. Bring the funeral back to how we can make it at home, you know. So the Mexican Day of the Dead has inspired so many people because it's a celebration, and it's joyous, I guess, you know, because it's your connection with your ancestors. And this is what we lack so much, is our connection with our ancestors. And a lot of the work that I've done previous to all this, you know, was to do with connecting. You know, I live up here on Dartmoor, where there are archaeological, you know, so many archaeological sites where we can see how people lived. and they were so connected to the land and to sheep. That was, you know, one of their ways of surviving was wool, you know.
It's interesting when we look at that, you know, how our ancestors, you know, celebrated, and there was Samhain, which got, you know, turned into Halloween. And rather than us, you know, celebrating our ancestors, you know, kids are all just, you know, dressing up as witches and running around getting sweets. And seeing that difference, and how the, yes, say in with the Day of the Dead through Central and South America, it's a real party. They go into the graveyards with loads of food and drink, and it is a massive party. And, you know, for us in our culture, we would think, oh my goodness, that's sacrilegious to have a party in a graveyard. You couldn't possibly do that. So, you know, these really different ways of thinking about death. And, you know, which is all just that part with, you know, our disconnect with ourselves, with our land, with, you know, the cycle of life. And so, you know, this discussion about bringing back, closing the cycle. And, you know, we look at compost as the ultimate closed loop system. And it's like, well, and that's why I get excited about the idea of, you know, our bodies going back to the land, you know, actually composting our bodies and, you know, growing, you know, trees or whatever from our bodies, and, you know, seeing that cycle. We came from the land and we end up going back into it. But, you know, we touched on earlier that what's normal is to be cremated. That's the normal thing here, is to go in a box and use massive amounts of fossil fuels. And we've got, you know, this big kind of climate and ecological breakdown being discussed, but we seem to not be talking about this huge amount of gas that is burnt in crematoriums. And, you know, not just the use of fossil fuels, but then, you know, the air pollution that happens above the crematoriums. You know, there's this really massive impact that just does not seem to be being discussed. And absolutely. One of our issues here, I'm in West Sussex, is that we've got no natural burial sites. All the churchyards are filling up. And so where are people going to get buried? And we know as gas prices go up, it's going to become more expensive to actually bury bodies, you know, going through that process of burning. So having this kind of revival of back to the land, literally, of, you know, there's a big talk about rewilding. So it makes perfect sense to actually, you know, bury the bodies first and then rewild the areas so we can do both at the same time. But I mean, that's a whole area within itself of you know, how you bury the bodies, because they can't be preserved if you're going to have a natural burial. And so, yeah, this kind of like process of, you know, not even thinking about wrapping the bodies in natural fibers. You know, people will put them in their, you know, favorite kind of, you know, football gear or whatever that's, you know, is synthetic materials, which again is not going to like help the bodies break down. So what do you think as well that we need to kind of talk about in that whole, you know, returning the body to the soil? What's the best way of doing that?
Well, of course, there's so much carbon within our bodies, so we owe it to the planet to return our carbon to the soil. So soil to soil, you know, we need to think in that term. So you know, it's a slow process of breaking down taboos. And actually, originally with the Victorian ethic, there was actually a taboo of cremation in this country. You know that, you know, it's a normal thing in some cultures to be cremated, and it's such a difficult conversation, and not many people want to have it because you know, I've resisted talking about this for a long, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've resisted talking about this concept of questioning and the whole thing around cremation, because that's releasing our carbon into the atmosphere along with anything else that is in our teeth, you know, in our bodies, plastics, metals, whatever. But it's also the wood in some cultures that you're using that should be used for something better and long term, or the other fuel. Environmentally, it's a massive amount of fuel, and you know, we're now sort of billions of people in population. We can't afford to keep doing this. But on the other hand, we're running out of what we think of as burial land. So do we need to start discussing, what if it's not burial land? You know, obviously we have to have laws about where you bury people. But, you know, in the UK, there's plenty of rural land. There's plenty of land that with a bit of imagination, we could turn into burial land. That doesn't solve the problem for people in the middle of cities and London and places like that, where actually, you know, I couldn't believe it recently. I had an order for a shroud to be somebody to be buried in Highgate churchyard, and I didn't know until a couple of weeks ago that's £26,000 to be buried in Highgate. Do I mean Highgate? Yeah, the cemetery, beautiful old cemetery. And we, you know, our cities have beautiful old cemeteries, and you know, personally, I love going to cemeteries, old Victorian cemeteries, because the carving is beautiful, and you know, it's rather like your background, actually, lots of growth, and you know, it's left to rewild, basically, a lot of these beautiful cemeteries, and these are actually valuable wildlife places within cities. So we should think about that, and some of those plots can be reused, so that there are lots of discussions about reusing existing graves. But also, I really think that developers, housing developers, should be in on this conversation, and that it should be enshrined in modern developments. Where do you have your health centre? Where do you have your, you know, your sewage? Well, hopefully not a sewage plant, but you know, a rebed for processing sewage. Where do you bury your dead? Let's have that in that conversation right at the beginning, so that we have enough space and a cultural shift to bury our dead within cities. And maybe I'm an idealist, but I think we have to start thinking outside the box, literally, you know, ditch the box, because that wood or MDF, whatever it is better served for the environment and for people if it's used for long-term products like furniture and housing and so on. Let's go back, but forward in my mind, to using just shrouds and accepting that, you know, I'm mortal, accepting that one day I'll die, and we need that connection. This is going back to the childhood thing. If we have our dead around us within cities, we can open those conversations with our children. It comes back to how you grow up with the notion of death as a fact and not a horror. It's what, you know, once, what it did for me, once I said I developed a taboo as a child, and part of that was a fear of death. And sometimes with taboos, with phobias, if you have a phobia, you're obsessed with that thing, like it might be spiders or something like that, and you're absolutely obsessed by it. But very often you can't even talk about it. You can't talk about that phobia. What is it that really frightens you? And when I made my first shroud as an expression of the continuum and life cycle, it was the most cathartic thing I've ever done in my whole life. And it broke down that terrible phobia and that inability to talk about it for me personally. So that's one thing that I really want to put across to people, is that once we start talking about death in a real and beautiful and held way, you know, something that, you know, like the death cafe movement, it opens up the conversation in a gentle way over a nice cup of tea and maybe a cake. And there's a website called Dinner with Death, I think it is, Dinner with Death. And you invite your friends, you create this kind of menu and a date, and you invite certain friends, and this is going to be the theme for your dinner, is talking about death. You know, things like that can help us grapple with this. But I think what I'm trying to say is to bring death into the conversation about life, because it helps you then to live properly. And so if we bring the dead into our lives, you know, the places where we put our dead, and make them beautiful places, whether it's part of rewilding, whether it's more conventional churchyard or cemetery, but always with ecology and nature as part of that. So it's very much present, and it's doing its job. It's recycling us, and that's beautiful.
It's we have a lovely friend as well, Jean, that has her Last Wishes workshop.
Yes.
And she's how important it is that, you know, you say, you know, what are the songs you want played at your funeral? You know, what are the readings you want? You know, what's the kind of the flavor of the day? Do you want everyone dressed in black? Do you want people celebrating your life? You know, actually you giving those, you know, your last wishes up front and saying, well, actually this is how I want it to be, really helps the families. Because obviously when a loved one dies, all of a sudden you've suddenly got to plan this. Do you just give it over to the undertakers, who just give it over to, you know, the funeral directors to play the standard hymns and, you know, read out something that may not be appropriate? Or actually, you know, bring that back to your literal, the last words that you want to share. I was recently at a funeral, and it was amazing because this friend, she had recorded a message before she died. And so being, you know, at her funeral beside this, her, you know, with her friends and family, and then her voice coming out of the speakers was really like, wow, you know, really shocking, but amazing. It was just such a beautiful message, her last message to us all. And I thought, you know, why don't more of us do that? You know, actually really think about and plan for the inevitable. And we never know when it's going to happen. And you know, I'm Sam, and I lost my dad when I was only 10. So we were both children. So we've always lived with that, you know, my life could be taken from me tomorrow. Doesn't mean to say we're all going to like get into our 80s and our 90s, and it doesn't work like that. It can happen anytime. So, you know, I think with your shrouds, you know, people are becoming more aware of like, actually, let's order them up front. Let's start talking about this before the inevitable. People buying their plots in natural burial sites, because obviously they're just going to get more expensive as time goes by and land becomes, you know, more valuable and rarer, which is definitely what's happened in this area. The prices of burial plots are going to go up. So, you know, it kind of makes sense, you know, economically as well, to have these discussions now and plan for the future. So,
yeah. So I was just going to say, I think also if you're a farmer, having a natural burial site can be part of your diversification and part of your income. It's a lot of work. You know, it's not taking it lightly, because you've got to go through planning permission and all this sort of thing. But you can keep it as part of the farm. So obviously not plough it up. We don't want any ploughing anyway. But wildflower meadow, which is grazed periodically by sheep, ideally, but also cattle, horses, pigs, not pigs, no, sorry. Cattle, horses, and sheep. And you can make those beautiful places. And one of my colleagues within, you know, we have a very thriving and burgeoning alternative in this country, thank goodness, started by Ken West, who Francis Jean will know. And he started the natural burial movement. But we also have very loose laws around burial. So you can actually bury somebody. I could bury somebody in my garden if I wanted to. there are things that you have to think about, and water being one of them, and it has to go on the deeds, it has to be recorded and so on. But you can do that, and that's enabled us to develop a different way of thinking about it. And so, a natural burial site, going back to farming, you can create a natural burial site on your farm and still have it in production. So it doesn't have to be sort of just land for the dead over there. That's what I feel we should be thinking about, is let's make it land where people happen to be buried, but we're also part of that land, whether we're enjoying the ecology of it or growing stuff, growing animals or stuff. I should also mention that, what seems to be the sort of more conventional end of funerals, how we do funerals, is, there's an acknowledgement that cremation will have to come to an end because of the problem of gas and, pollution as well. And it's being sort of replaced at the moment by this thing called resumation, which is where you dissolve the body in an alkaline solution and then jiggle it around in a huge machine and reduce it right down to a few bones. And then you can take that away and bury that.
And what's going to happen to that toxic liquid?
Yes. What is going to happen to that? And that is not resolved. And some of that will go into our waterways. So I'm not keen on that at all, partly because it's the same old paradigm of an industrial process to deal with our dead. And it still continues that disconnection with the land. Whereas what I would like to see in urban situations, until we can sort out how we are with death, is something called Recompose, which has started in America, in Seattle. Kathleen Spade, I think she's called, who is an architect, young, and she's created this concept of composting bodies in a more, not industrial, because she makes the places beautiful, but in a more organized way. And I think for the time being, that is a very good solution within cities. My only sort of reservation, and I don't know enough about it because there's not a huge amount written yet about it, is that they have to grow stuff, so alfalfa or straw, some sort of material to put with the bodies to compost it. But I don't think that's a huge problem, and I would just much rather see develop, because it's connecting us back to the soil. We are being returned to soil.
And eventually. I think people would, prefer, they're used to this idea of giving your ashes back. And if you were to give them a little container of soil, of compost back of their loved one, much nicer idea than here's some toxic liquid where your loved one has been melted down. I mean, that idea of giving back some soil, that does sound, and as always, England's a little bit behind the times, and we're not even having this conversation about composting bodies, which makes absolute sense. And just finally, this this idea of what's normal is to be buried 6 foot under, which is also not ideal.
No, it's not. It's okay. In that you could then have subsequent burials on top, and actually. Talking to Nikki, my husband, the composter, Nikki, about that, and I've communicated with the body farm in America to get the science on it, which is that, people worry about the methane that is emitted from anaerobic deep burial. So how I'm reassured about that is that the methane slowly goes up through the soil layers, but it's actually consumed in the top 9 to 12 inches of live soil before it can cause any problem in the atmosphere. So actually methane leach from burial isn't really a problem if it's done reasonably well.
But shallower sites would be more ideal,
so
where the soil is more alive, so it's able to break the body down quicker.
That's what's recommended in natural burial sites, is a maximum of 3 foot. Of course, the benefits of a shroud burial is that you don't have an air pocket. With a coffin, you have an air pocket, and you have a much slower breakdown because there's wood in the way. And so with a shroud burial, you have an immediate contact with the earth, and that's going to be much quicker. And there's not going to be any air pockets. So actually, you can even go shallower than that. So 2 foot with maybe, I'm going to suggest it, biochar.
I mean, this conversation can go on and on and
Yeah.
on, but I'm really hoping that we've been able to, you know, just get you thinking about, you know, the subject which is not discussed enough. You know, actually, you know, how do we want our final resting places to be? What do we want the end of our life to be? And to start thinking about land use as well, and the use of this vast amount of gas which we're using in the process. So thank you, Yuli, for coming along and breaking the taboo and getting us to talk about this. And so we will leave it there. And Yuli, I will put Yuli's website on the end of the link, Bella Couche, and check out all her beautiful shrouds that she makes. And so thank you all until the next time. Thank you, Yuli.
Thank you.